Welcome to our webinar today on homelessness, mental illness, and the clashing of personal and public interests. We've seen that there is a relationship between the increasing rise in homelessness and the rise in mental illness. I hear, for example, in survey work that we've done with youth, that one of the principal issues that they are expressing today is their own concern with mental illness, either of themselves or of others. So we'll be exploring today the community options to address homelessness as we come to understand better who they are, where they've come from, and what are the options. And then what are the implications of the public tolerance wearing thin? We know here in Edmonton, for example, that the courts have recently been authorizing the police to proceed with clearing the encampments. That's a major issue, but to where? Where do we clear them to? And what are the alternatives? So without any further ado, Leif, I'm going to introduce you as one of our panelists, then Melissa, and then Marianne Soroka. And then we'll open it up for public discussion, the Q&As and commentary from our viewers. So Leif, what brings you here today?
I'm Leif Gregersen. I'm a freelance journalist. I think it was 10 days ago, I published an opinion article in the Edmonton Journal about mental health in the holidays. I had uncovered some very disturbing research about mental health. Funny enough, the holidays are not the highest time of the year for suicides. It's actually late spring, early summer. I can't tell you why. So I also have lived experience of mental illness. I deal with an illness called schizoaffective disorder with anxiety, which means I have a combination of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder along with anxiety. And I've traveled a fair bit. I got stuck down in California and was homeless for a while there. Later in my travels, I came back to Edmonton, and due to my mental health and my burning of bridges, so to speak, when I had last been in Edmonton, I grew up here. I had nowhere to stay, so I ended up being in the shelter and being homeless while I was suffering from mental illness, and that was a very difficult time.
You've been in, you had the category, you had the experience, you're an exemplary of someone who once had mental illness and that designation and have now recovered. I'm going to ask Melissa just to jump in next. Melissa, you and I knew one another 20 years ago at a time when you were involved in the training program. Are conditions then relevant to the discussion we're having today?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly relevant, primarily because, with my background in mental health and the life skills training centers address of mental illness and training individuals with coping skills to be able to get themselves to a point where they can utilize services and live independently, have job readiness training, etc. And the training center, many agencies were referring to the training center back then. It was sponsored by Canadian Mental Health, and the Alberta Hospital had an ongoing program specifically to develop coping skills for the mentally ill. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people, when they think of homelessness, they label it as a condition. And unfortunately, they're not humanized. I mean, much what Taylor was saying before we started to record and others jumped on is the centers where they can go and just have a bed overnight. They're not safe. These are not services that allow this individual to get off the street. They're not living conditions that would be favorable to a family.
So 24, 25 years ago, whatever this was, I mean, your program and many of the services that were then being developed in Alberta, which is relatively young. I mean, we are not a province of hundreds of years, but mental health was becoming an issue. It was Ronald Reagan or Thatcher or who was in charge in Canada, charged that the mental institutions were not the right place for these people. And they started decanting or deinstitutionalizing. And rather than moving the money from the institution to the community, this seemed to be a cost savings measure. And the infrastructure of preparing the people, preparing the community, developing the services was relatively new. Mm-hmm. Today, it's gotten out of control. At that time, it seemed to be marginal and not, I wouldn't say incidental, but the word dumping comes to mind.
Absolutely. There's more need than there are beds, to the point of people being able to just have, a hot meal and to sleep in a shelter overnight. There's more need than there are beds. So this encampment, this is not a solution. It is a point of the spear that public opinion has created. But all we're doing is displacing people from a place that they've created for themselves. But it's not a solution. Where are they going to go? We
Okay,
don't
so
have services
let's
out
jump
to house
into
them.
the world of the Sorokas. We have Taylor and Murray, who, out of their own frustration and their empathy, have said enough is enough. Let's get involved and see if we can do something. So, Murray, tell us a little bit about the origins of your interest in Taylor's and what it is you've been offering.
Yes, thank you. 16 years ago, we just saw the need in West Edmonton, where we were located, and started the Jasper Place Wellness Center. And from that time, we've been running a Housing First program for 15 years. And we actually piloted Housing First in Edmonton in 2008. So we've seen the need grow. And we also have seen the need for affordable housing. And that's really the crux of it all. There's a supply and demand issue. There's way more demand than there is supply for affordable housing. And that's why we have this massive amount of homelessness. We have a lot of in-migration into Alberta. I think in the last 18 months, we've had over 100,000 people move to Alberta. There's no apartments left. So even Housing First can't work without an apartment. And other programs can't work without a home to go to. So now we've just decided shelters is the way to go, because we stopped building as a country and as a province, as a city, stopped building social housing 20, 30 years ago. And now here we are without enough housing. And that's really the crux of the issue.
So if housing were the issue and we only need to put housing in place, have we then solved the problem? Are there employment opportunities? Is there 24-hour recreation or support or counseling or hospital access? Are all of the things that we need besides just housing there, and all we need now is housing? Taylor, you want to step in here?
I think all of those things are components that can be added to housing, and that's where we see the most success. So I would frame it as we have to have housing, just like when you go to the mall, you're going to shop somewhere else than me. And I think housing needs to be viewed very similarly. So there's currently a need for housing support. So programs that have, or buildings that have programs inside to help maintain housing for people. And that's a running scale, almost like a spectrum. So I might live in a housing program or in a affordable housing building that has no programming attached to it, because I have my own support network. I have a solid doctor, a solid pharmacist. I have people I can connect with if I'm going into crisis. For other people who may not have that, we need to look at how do we build that into housing. So Housing First is one step of that. But for individuals who can't live alone in market housing, maybe due to mental health, maybe due to substance misuse, how do we build housing that incorporates some of that programming? Currently in Edmonton, there's two kind of groups that focus on that work. We would be part of both groups, where we do supported housing, where it's no medical support on site, but we do have staff members who can help with crisis, with guest management, and that scales all the way up to housing in Edmonton that has managed alcohol and has managed cannabis on site, with the understanding there's doctors and nurses working in this housing just to ensure people have the support networks, one, but also the ability to maintain that housing, and from there build a life that they like. So I think it's a pretty big scale, and I like to reflect it, like I said, as shopping. You're going to go somewhere else than me because we have different shopping needs. Housing is very similar that way. So no, it's not just about the home. It's about how do we support people to build that foundation to then move forward in life.
So is your program, I know Doug Sador is with us today, and he operates a program. I presume it's somewhat similar, because he talked about, when we interviewed him in October, the social supports that were available, not just the housing. But what is the criteria for success then? Is simply getting someone out of a tent and into an apartment deemed a success? Because I think you've indicated for some, the answer might be yes. If they're traveling across the country or they're new immigrants, they've got a job, but they don't have shelter, that's one thing. But if they've got a mental health issue or an addictions issue, it seems that shelter alone isn't going to be enough. And I think you've made that point. Is your program in demand in this community? I mean, it's such an obvious answer, but go ahead. Tell me a little bit about rising demand and where it's coming from.
Yes, I would say all of the housing programs in Edmonton are at max capacity right now. We need more. Marie identified affordable housing. I look at that as an umbrella. So from supported housing to supported living being on the medical side, there's a high need for it across the board and in all different shapes, sizes, and operators. Currently, there is I would say most of the housing projects, ours and other operators in the city, are reaching capacity. And beyond reaching capacity, the cost of living for individuals has gone up. I think all of us can identify that. And one thing I want to point out is the majority of individuals experiencing homelessness in Alberta make about $866 from Alberta Works. And if you're on AISH, that's about $1,700. So having the supports built into the housing where we can connect with people, where we can have intercommunity relationships and socialize is even more important. And we're seeing people want that support. Every time I engage with someone who's sleeping outside or was sleeping in our shelter, what are my next steps? How do I get there? Can you help me get there?
That's a very important principle. I want to reinforce that and hear that again. And I know within the audience there are people that would reinforce this principle. When someone says, I want help, they're acknowledging they have a problem. And I think Justin Burford said as much when we interviewed him, Doug, from Strathcona, who had received the Rotary Award for all of his contributions since he's recovered. But the point was made, it's not empathy isn't enough. What we're looking for is we want to become independent. We are interested in a life, a quality of life, and the shelter is not our destination. We want to get out of this.
Absolutely. One of the things I like to mention is when I was operating the emergency shelter, I had to take away people's autonomy to ensure that the space at large was safe. And that's when you don't have your personal autonomy, you can't have food at your bed. You can't have your coat with you because you might be hiding something in there. That lack of personal autonomy makes it very hard to see yourself as a whole individual. And I like to say that housing can be the foundation. When you can close your door and shut the world out and have some peace of mind, that autonomy to do that is the foundation to building and realizing the life we want. Absolutely.
I can recall personally some years ago when we were developing group homes. Now that's 6, you might say, a form of institution, but the reality was for people that had been living in an institution of 4,000 to move into an environment of 6, or from a bedroom of 200 to a bedroom of 1. I can remember this fellow in his wheelchair with a pretty severe developmental disability, and I didn't wheel him, I'd heard the story, but wheeling him into that bedroom, and he knew that this was now his room. He kicked the door closed because he, for the first time, had autonomy. And that word autonomy seems to come up over and over again, that living in a shelter with 200 beds in that room, well, what's that like? Leif, you experienced some of that in your California journey.
I did
experience in the public shelter system?
Well, I have had experience having to stay at the I forget what it's called now. It used to be called the Single Men's Hostel. It's still there under a different name. One thing I did want to mention is you had mentioned group homes, and when I was about 29 years old, I had a very serious hospitalization. I was in Alberta Hospital for 6 months. It was very difficult. I was a wreck when I got out, and there wasn't a lot of places for me to go. I first thought maybe I'll get an apartment, but then they suggested I go into a group home. And I went into a group home, and it was very poorly managed. There was one person who wanted to rent out to these people at very high rates to pay her mortgage and to get them to shovel her walks, and it was just horrible. But my social worker at the clinic, I go to the 108th Street Clinic for biweekly injections and to see my psychiatrist. My social worker at the clinic found me an E4C group home and Edmonton City Center Church Corporation.
Mhm.
And this was a huge difference and probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. All of a sudden, I was getting regular meals, regular sleep, regular medication. They had activities for us, which were later cut back, but they would still take us to movies or out to play pool or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I found it extremely beneficial. And they didn't put any pressure on me that I had to move out at a certain time. I actually lived there for a total of 15 years.
Mhm.
And then when they sort of released me, um, they helped me get independent housing, which was subsidized. And it was just it was just an experience of help that I've never found anywhere else. And I do agree though that there's so little of this. And I mean, like the group home I was in had 20 spots. It was a men's group home. And I think one of the biggest things about going into a group home like that, if it's well run, is when you have a mental illness and you go into a group home like that, everyone else also has a mental illness.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Yeah.
either that or they're people who are trained to deal with mental illnesses. So all of a sudden the stigma is gone and you can build your community and it was just great. And that was 20 years ago and I'm still in the same community and I have many friends and yeah.
Yeah, the group home system that I was familiar with that we were building in the 70s into the early 80s, we had a quadrant system with Catholic Social Services in the Northeast, Skills in the Northwest, Good Samaritan in the Southwest, and L'Arche in the Southeast. And we had 55 group homes. And no would we ever allow more than 6 in a group home, because that's as many as you could get in a car. And in order to be mobile and participate in the community, you needed to be relatively small. Secondly, to be in a neighborhood that was welcoming and accepting, you didn't want to overwhelm it. So there were a number of guiding principles that we, as a grant provider, insisted upon in order to ensure that those homes were in fact functioning as homes. But I don't think that model has been followed. If you're talking about and calling it a group home.
Oh, well, there was
dozens
actually
of people.
4 or 5 houses for 20 people. So there was no more than 4 or 5 people in a home.
Yeah, we call that deviancy juxtaposition, but I'll leave that alone. Okay.
Okay.
Taylor, you want to jump in with anything? Or Melissa, I didn't give you a chance to come back. What are you hearing today versus what we were experiencing or hoping for back 20 years ago?
Part of the concerning part is transitioning people. Leif was talking about that more so from coming out of, Edmonton Hospital. It's, treatment centers, it's the justice system, and having an ability to transition from those types of services into reintegration into the community. And that's what our background from the Life Skills Training Center was doing, sponsored by Canadian Mental Health. Today, those programs are academic. They're not experiential. And unfortunately, pretty well anybody who has a computer can learn the skill sets from the comfort of their own home and then try to teach that to individuals who are transitioning from these agencies. And it's highly ineffective, primarily because you cannot teach someone how to ask for help when you don't understand what's in their way, the fear and the years of abuse that they've experienced. You cannot do that in a classroom. You have to do it in an experiential learning environment. And that's what we did for many years, was deal with those transitional issues. And, you said, what's missing? Well, housing obviously is missing. However, the transition of the mental health condition and having individuals have some element of agency for themselves, they need the skill sets to be able to do that. The basic fundamental coping skills, communication skills, dealing with previous mental health conditions and maintaining themselves as a community member and being able to go to work. I mean,
So if a transition is to be something more than dumping, and I can remember the deinstitutionalization movement in Chicago was a bus. But if it's to be more than dumping, then there should be a plan and there should be preparation. And the individual who's part of that should be prepared. The community should be ready. And that infrastructure of services should be available ahead of time. But I asked ChatGPT, as you know, my brilliance comes from knowing how to operate ChatGPT. I asked ChatGPT, what measures can be taken to increase the resilience of teenagers subjected to emotional stress? Now, this is a little bit light. I'm not talking here about people coming from corrections and being dumped from a remand center, or people reaching 18 in child welfare and foster care being dumped into community, or people being exited from an emergency ward one day because their time is up or whatever. I'm talking about teenagers that are getting ready to grow up and who are now 18 to 26 when they start getting ready to take a job and move into community. And virtually everything it cited, increasing the resilience, was emotional education, supportive relationships, healthy lifestyles, stress management techniques, professional help, safe environments, building coping skills, open communications, empowerment. I mean, it's all there.
mhm.
Why are we having so much difficulty? Is it a lack of funding? Is it a lack of understanding the needs of people? Why is it that we feel we're working in a vacuum? Go ahead, Leif.
I did an interview with a police constable who worked for the police and crisis team, PACT, and he said that they're seeing more and more mental health issues. And one of the things he suggested was that it's possible that because there's less stigma and more people are becoming aware of it, and post-COVID, we're really being aware that school children were highly affected in their mental health. He thinks because of this awareness and this, people aren't as afraid to ask for help, that we don't have more people who have mental illnesses. We just have more people who are seeking help, and it's overloading the system.
Yeah, I think that there may be, does anyone add to that? Because it seems to me as soon as you say we have a issue and you bring that issue out into the public, you have people like reading Introductory Psychology 101 that say, hey, that's one of me, or maybe I could be, or maybe I should be, or maybe I will be homeless. It's becoming, well, we're almost feeding it. And I don't want to undervalue the relevance of those that are in homeless, because that's part of the transition of people moving from one town to another and going for shelter for a day or two. That's really not who we're talking about today. Well, what the people living on the streets in Vancouver or living on the bridges in Edmonton, these people are living, as you noted, Leif, for years. So when you clear an encampment and the police are empowered to do so, and they've got some social skills, but they're not social workers. Let's not confuse the role of public safety and public policing with the role of a social worker who may join them, or they may be sympathetic, but at some point in time, they've got a job to do.
I did have a comment. I'll be real quick about it because you actually sort of asked Taylor.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that there's some homeless encampments near where I walk to go to a friend's house each day. And what's really sad is there'll be 5 or 6 tents, and then I'll come back in a couple of days and one of them will have burned to the ground.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah.
terrifies me, because if you're in a tent and it catches fire, you can be horribly maimed or killed. And once again, I wonder, I read this, I read Steinbeck, what was it called? The Grapes of Wrath.
Mm-hmm.
And they had built an encampment for people who couldn't find work. And they had a serious issue with keeping sanitation under control.
Yeah.
And it was just if you've read that book, and I'm sure most of you have, it really opens your eyes to a problem that's been here for a long time. And it sort of exposes the whole capitalistic system and all that sort of stuff.
Well, we heard or we read about hobos. I think that's what they were called at that time, and they rode the rails. So it was cited by some as rather romantic. Is you sat around a campfire, you got on a train, and you went looking for work, and that was in the 30s. It's a little bit different, but maybe only a little bit different. I know again in October when we were looking at what was going on in North America and we had interviews with people from New Mexico. I was hearing about a program in a community in Maine where they finally gave up and the city said, look, we will buy you shelters, but the tent must be fireproof. We will bring food trucks onto the site and there will be sanitation. And we've accepted the fact that this is going to have to be a way of life until we found other alternatives. Murray, you've been silent and with a good smile. Sounds like we're doing the right thing here. Anything we're missing?
Well, there's a few things. I would want to say that Crab Park in Vancouver is a legal campground where there is sanitation and garbage removal and bathrooms. So it can be done, and maybe it has to be done. But I also want to point out that there's a lot of studies that show 50, 60, 70% of people that are experiencing homeless have a brain injury. Yeah. And, so it's not only mental illness that people are suffering, but they have a brain injury and are struggling to function in society the way we think people should function. So it's really hard to be a good neighbor when you have an apartment because you have a brain injury. It's really hard to pay your bills on time because you have a brain injury. So it's really difficult to live alone. And why people are choosing encampments over shelter, because there's a sense of community. There's a sense of belonging. We all have a social safety net in our lives where, I'll call up Perry and we'll go for a coffee at Starbucks and he'd spend $10 on a coffee. But that's our sense of community. When you have no money, you have to have a sense of community just to survive. And there's a sense of family. There's a sense of a cohort in a camp where, again, as Taylor mentioned, it just doesn't happen in a shelter when you've been stripped of all your autonomy and the guy that raped you is sleeping 3 beds over. I mean, there's a beautiful quote from an author last week who wrote in the Globe and Mail, and maybe if you permit me to read it, I'll read it because he experienced homelessness and he had a great thing to say about it. And I'll just read it to you. He says, "There's one thing I know from my experience in Tent City. It's that while drugs and booze sometimes lead to homelessness, being homeless can make you turn to anything. In urban North America, the hardest aspect of vacancy is not hunger, it's not thirst, it's not even exposure to the elements. The most torturous part of not being able to relax, not fully in any kind of real comfort and safety. Even the psychic stress, eventually the psychic stress and exhaustion can break a person so that a hit of something to become less fully aware is just a tiny bit of grace." So homelessness, and we've seen this, Taylor and I have seen this, homelessness leads to substance abuse. About 80% of the people we meet that are experiencing homeless did not use drugs and alcohol in a proper way before they were homeless. But just you fall into this black hole of homelessness and it's really hard to get out of. And when you just look around, there's no apartments to rent in Edmonton. What are you going to do? And then, all the support that needs to go with it. So it's a very complex issue and it's a very hard issue to resolve. But again, I just go back to first thing we need is apartments. We need homes and they cost a lot of money to build, really a lot of money to build. And then if you're going to rent them out affordably, you're going to lose money on it. So there's no value proposition for a developer to build at all. So that means you need grants. Well, governments can't solve this problem. I can tell you the city of Edmonton does not have enough money or wherewithal to build all the affordable housing units we need. That's not even their mandate. The province of Alberta cannot solve this problem alone. They do not have the wherewithal to build thousands of apartments just in Edmonton, let alone right across this province. And the federal government, well, don't even get me started on the federal government. They don't have the ability to solve it either, even though they have spent tens of millions of dollars in Edmonton in the last couple of years. It's not enough. We build a few hundred units and we need thousands of units. So really it's going to take a collective effort. It's going to take you, me, the business community. It's going to take the faith community. And I think we really have to get to a place that says, let's stop giving money to soup kitchens, to shelters, to clothing exchanges, because that just keeps people in homelessness. So we have a machine that almost keeps people homeless.
And you've touched on so many different dimensions I want to jump in with. I've got to pick one, and that's prevention. I will come back to how can a community absorb this fringe element of people from brain injuries to you name it. I mean, you are talking about but I asked the American Psychiatric Association, how many categories are there now of mental health? It's 70. We are asking to talk about people who cannot maintain a lifestyle, who need support of some sort, and that a community will be able to accommodate all 70 all 70 categories. This is one hell of a challenge. I mean, Leif, what you have is relatively minor compared with people that were Pinoca that Claire knows of that had brain injury. And how is a community going to be able to cope? And it's not just housing. You pointed that out, Murray. If we look at the costs, what we are going to end up with again is institutions of hundreds and thousands. Because if cost is the only issue, that's how we got into this mess. They closed them down because they were expensive. And now what we have is communities falling apart. Leif, go ahead.
Yeah, in the research I did for my articles on Built for Zero Canada and Medicine Hat and Edmonton and all that, one of the things I learned was that it costs quite a bit for a person to stay homeless. There's hospitalizations, there's charities, there's police responses, there's all these things. And it actually costs a lot less to house them adequately. It's actually a good business decision for
Sure.
any government to house the homeless. It saves money. I wish I could remember exactly how much. But it's like a difference between 55,000 a year and like 25,000 to house them properly. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I just wanted to back up something that what Murray said. Basically, I had heard that when a young person, and the majority of young people who become homeless, like under 18 or very close to 18, are facing gender issues at home. A lot of them. And one of the really, really sad things is that when a person who's when a young person becomes homeless, it's been figured out that it's a matter of weeks between them becoming homeless, doing zero drugs, to using needle drugs. And it's just horrific.
That gender issue came up where Justin up in Strathcona talked about the last thing you want to be is a good-looking woman in the homelessness world, for reasons I don't need to elaborate on. So the gender issue is extremely serious as it relates to women. Are there families finding themselves in the homelessness world? Taylor?
Yes, actually, I was just in a sector emergency response meeting last week. It's one of our province's highest concern, and unfortunately, the littlest amount of funding goes to spaces that are safe for families to go. And one of the bigger concerns is, for instance, if it's a woman's shelter and this woman who goes to the shelter has a 16-year-old son or a 14-year-old son, they can be turned away from some of these spaces. So it's a huge concern, especially again when we're looking at a bachelor suite in Edmonton costs over $900. There's no way certain families can live at that cost, and we don't put the same backing towards family-based supports in emergency ways that we do for others. So you've hit it on the head. It's a growing issue, and it's something in our sector where we're looking at each other saying, okay, there's not enough funding and there's not enough hands and there's a growing need.
Yeah, I'm further concerned with another point. I hear of people coming from the Ukraine, women mainly, because the men are being left behind, and finding employment and finding places, people who bring them into their homes and they get a start. And I can remember when my wife and I moved, we took some of our excess furniture, made it available. So there was a community of support for people coming in from Ukraine. And yet I hear Canada has an ambition to bring 1 million people in next year. And yet here we're hearing about the people who are living here, falling off the wagon and living in shelters. There's something really messed up here from a policy perspective. And I'm not anti-immigration by any means. Don't get me started on Trump and bad blood. But How can we have a major, massive immigration program when we can't even accommodate the people in our own communities?
One of the issues of homelessness is that it's an indigenous issue.
Right.
I just double checked my facts, and approximately 5% of Edmonton's population is indigenous, but they represent 54% of the homeless population. And I've only come up with one really good idea to deal with the situation of homeless people. What about subsidizing volunteers to renovate their homes, to put an in-law suite, and having them take in somebody who's sponsored by the government to get them out of homelessness? And these people don't just house them and be their landlord. They make sure they're eating. They make sure they have their needs, that sort of thing. I don't know.
No, but I think you're onto something. When we talk about prevention, whether it be in corrections and saying that when people are in corrections, they should be being prepared for community and not just incarcerated and left in isolation. So if you've lived for 6 months in a rebound center, or 6 weeks for that matter, and you're not ready to come back, somebody's failing community because they're now being dumped. If we look at the indigenous population migrating into our urban centers, and it's massive, what is being done to either prevent that by making sure that the conditions that they're coming from, where there is housing, they're not leaving it? Someplace this indigenous population with these ratios you're talking about are leaving housing, or they don't have housing. If we have a problem of that scale, we should be looking at housing in those indigenous communities that have the financing and are getting it as a preventative strategy. I didn't talk, but I've heard from the chief of police in Edmonton of the criminal element in Edmonton. I've also heard him say that we have the provincial remand center. And so as people are discharged from the remand, they're discharged into Edmonton when they've come from Calgary. Maybe that ought to be fixed.
Absolutely.
Of heads. Go ahead, Taylor.
Yes, that's it's a big concern. When I was growing up, Edmonton was always considered the gateway to the north. And in my work, I consider us the gateway to the south. And I think I know for a fact from my work, there's thousands of people who now call Edmonton home who've been trapped here, essentially. You've pointed out there might not be resources on their home nations, but if we're talking about Northern Canada, most individuals who have any healthcare need are being transported through Alberta to Edmonton from their northern community to receive a level of care. Now, let's say you run into your cousin while you're receiving this level of care and you might miss your flight home, or a crisis happens, or you lose your bank card, or you lose your ID. Now you're trapped in a city where you're not familiar. This happens on a very high basis. The other thing I would like to point out is Maria and I have worked closely with Tall Cree tribal government over the last year. And one of the things they have said is many of the youth or young individuals aged 18 to about 35 who come to the city don't have strong connections to the city and can end up slipping through the cracks and don't make it home. So you come for education, you have a crisis. I know I went to Vancouver for university and I have had a crisis, and my parents had to come out and help me and navigate it. Mental health is hard. Being a human on earth is hard. So if you don't have that support and something happens, your life can be flipped upside down in an instant. And there's high numbers of this. You're exactly right. But I don't think it's as simple as sending people home, but I think we do need to start investing in better housing on nations, and on urban reserves. I think we're going to see, and I know there's many Indigenous leaders specifically in Alberta that are working towards building Indigenous urban reserves so that this crisis, if it happens, they can find someone who speaks their language, who looks like them, who might know their auntie, and have a community instantly. And that crisis has now gone from a deep fall into homelessness into, okay, I just got to turn it around here. I have the support and we're ready to go.
Well, I mean, that's a major recommendation. It would seem to me that 54% of those deemed homeless in the community, this community anyway, are Indigenous. Then we've got a strategy and a preventative measure on how do we reduce the influx and make sure that the style of living and the accommodations in their own community are adequate and supportive. Sharon, you've got a question. I think we'll entertain questions and comments from the audience.
Oh, thanks, Perry. I'm sitting with your number here of 70 categories of mental health, and I was with you during the days when you helped develop the community for people with mental handicaps who wanted to be and needed to be integrated in the communities back then, and spent a lot of time at Ponoka and Alberta Hospital Edmonton with those individuals before and while they were being shut down. But what we have here now is NIMBY, of course, going on. We had NIMBY back then. All those years ago, we had NIMBY going on for people with mental handicap, innocent individuals, of course, joyous individuals. There was NIMBY going on then, and there's NIMBY going on now in places like Wetaskiwin, which is the latest story that we're hearing about. But today we have now such a massive problem, and we can all know and identify the problems. We know about active treatment hospitals where people with coming off the street are being admitted and then released back onto the street at 4 o'clock in the morning. And of course, they have no place to go as well. We have the pharma companies we know that I think destroyed a generation when they released painkillers to people who just simply needed to manage some form of mental, probably physical and mental health challenges. We have that problem. And today I sing with the John Cameron Choir, who himself suffers from mental health. He's a major developer in the city, and where we have to raise funds for mental health through that event, that singular event at the Jubilee Auditorium in Edmonton and Calgary. And there is a reason why it's taken all of these years to be able to fill the Jubilee Auditorium with people who would support mental health recovery. Executives and sponsors were embarrassed to be in the same room at the front of the theater because they might be identified as having a mental health problem. Otherwise, would I be in this room and giving money to this cause? So now we have a great fear of people with mental health problems. We don't know if how they're going to present themselves. We don't have the least bit of skills in working and living with or believing in people with mental health problems. So rather than, I mean, there's preventative health thing, the whole segment of 70 categories of thousands of people were dismissed for generation after generation. We were embarrassed. We felt fear. We felt that maybe we're 1 degree of separation of landing on the street ourselves. So maybe that fear was affecting all of us up until now. I have a sister who has lived 25 years with her very, very serious mental health problems. And it is not something I would wish on anybody's family at all. But today, the question is, we know what the issues are. We know what the ongoing problems are. We need to know what we can do today. And can we not perhaps turn some of those empty commercial units, at least in the downtown quarter or anywhere in our cities, and somehow rehabilitate them for home care? This is a wonderful room with 29 people or however many people who have got opinions. And we're going to be talking to each other. But we do need political action here. And we need to knock on doors and continue on and help those organizations such as Murray and Taylor that are operating today. End of comment. Thank you.
Often in an initiative like this, where we have a community problem, we start out with elevating a level of awareness. Unfortunately, in this area, the level of awareness takes us into all of the stigma associated with the 70 different categories. When we start focusing on housing first, we take the focus away from all of those categories and the personal problem and start talking about solutions. So it seems to me what we learned in October, and I think what we're hearing today, we need more discussion on solutions and using the word independence and autonomy.
I guess what I'm wondering, are things like the recidivism, so to speak, someone gets into this 2 or 3 years and something happens and they come out and never go back. And yet there's others that continually make these round trips.
Hi, as far as recidivism for jail goes, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I do know that in my earlier years when I was suffering from a mental illness, I didn't like being in the hospital. I didn't want to be in the hospital. But sometimes the alternative of living on my own, being unsupported, not having a group of friends or a recreation program, it was actually better for me to be in the hospital. And this is a common thing. A lot of doctors in the emergency room will basically find that half the people there don't really need to go to the hospital. They're just, they're lonely. They're trying to do something to alleviate their loneliness, their unhappiness.
Well, in the interview we had with Doug, and Doug, you might want to jump in here. I'm trying to recall Justin explaining to us that there was a point in time where you became so desperate that you actually went out and committed a crime because you wanted shelter, sustenance, and safety, and you didn't mind going to a jail for a few days. Doug?
Yeah, those are all common things that we hear. We deal almost universally with addictions, and we know certain things, in terms of working with individuals, coming alongside peer support are absolutely essential, and the safe supportive housing, and everything that I've heard today, I shake my head and say, yes, that's all the stuff we're dealing with. But we must never forget we're dealing with human beings.
Right.
We're dealing with people, and they're not programmable, and so the answers lie in community. There isn't a government solution here. It's going to take all of us working together, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but that's what it's going to take. It's going to take everything that's been mentioned today in terms of looking at someone as a human being, a fellow journey, or whatever you want to call them, from your perspective, and being willing to walk with them. I know that's what saved me. Okay, as somebody was willing to say, Doug, here's how we do this. Okay, and the continuum. We talk about housing. Well, if you come from treatment into our center and stay, 6 to 12 months, where do you go after that? And the likelihood of maybe ending up back on the street or wherever is staring you in the face. I worked in the prison system for almost 10 years. So yeah, that's what happened. So I'm getting parole tomorrow. Well, where are you going? I don't know where I'm going. And so it's not a matter of a safety net. It's a matter of looking at life from where we all live, I'm assuming, and then how do we bring others along in that same journey to give, it's more than just giving a chance. It's looking at life through what we know about human existence, what we know about living in community. Again, I've talked to, I would say, hundreds of people that said, yeah, I'm going back to the street because at least there I have a little bit of, freedom, a little bit of community, a little bit of, and I don't understand that because I've never been homeless, but I do understand what they're saying and why they're saying it. So we just have to come back to this idea that the answer lies in community. The answer lies in community, and it's going to take all of us to be able to say.
You've made two very good points there. I mean, yes, the answer lies in community, but it lies in community recognizing we're talking about individuals.
That's right.
The individual differences are not addressed by putting a lot of labels out there. There are many labels and there are thousands of people, and therein lies the challenge of dealing this with almost like it's one at a time, Mary, and I see Taylor, you're nodding your head. When we interviewed Justin made a very, very, very good point. Is if you're going to address this problem, you've got to have the homeless involved in your discussions.
That's right.
I remember reading, and I have the notes here of a construction association invited to a conference to talk about homelessness, but there were no homeless people brought into the environment. And so they talked about construction and facilities, but had nothing to do with the social element of what makes a house into a home. Justin also talked about readiness.
Yeah.
That until he was ready, no amount of support was going to work, and you need to be there with early intervention to get in there early.
Yeah.
If you don't hit them early, and they become embedded in that culture, well, take it from there, Taylor.
I just couldn't agree more that as JP with Murray and I, the most success we ever have is in situations where someone has come to us and said, I'm facing this problem and this is what I need.
Yeah.
Answers. This is a human experience. Everyone on this call, I think, is human. Everyone we come into contact with is a human. There is way more things we have in common than we have in difference. So if we can start with basic conversations and engaging and meeting each other in our simple humanity, we can grow from there. One of the examples I would like to share is Murray and I have a housing design. In this design, we have no units on the main floor. It looks like an infill house, and there's no units on the main floor. And the second and third floor each have 6 units, so 12 total. The 1/3 of the building is dedicated to common area. Hang out, build relationships. Second to that is most people who we've worked with who live on a main floor of a building get an eviction notice at one point or another because your life follows you home. Someone's knocking on your window, maybe you leave your window open and someone comes in. That's a very common thing. So we have built our housing out of this direct engagement with our community. And now in operation, this is the housing programs where I see the most success. I have a housing building that has 30 units. I hate sending people there if I'm being very transparent in this meeting because people self-isolate. There's no common area. It's hard for me to bring activities and community into that space. So in engagement with the residents who are living there, they said, when you go build your next one, create common areas so we can hang out and have movie night. Karaoke happens every Wednesday. Y'all missed it last night. But I can tell you that is a huge driver for people to want to stay in that space and build relationships and be truly themselves. And like I said, in the 30-unit building, one of the buildings we have people self-isolate. We can see substance use go up. We can see mental health crises go up. That unplanned health need goes up in how often we see it. So you're exactly right. If we center ourselves on listening to the human facing the experience that is hard, that is the problem, the solutions will be presented. And I think I want to be clear, JP doesn't have all the answers. Absolutely not. I can serve one specific demographic that feels like they see themselves in what I can offer. And I need Doug, and I need Sharon, and I need everybody else to bring their piece of community to the forefront too.
We've stopped talking to government at that sense of me talking to government, and we did it last night. We had someone from Dan Williams' office come and talk to our guys. They need to hear what our guys have faced coming out of addiction, working through the treatment center, and so if they don't hear from them, they're just hearing everything secondhand. And I talked to him this morning. He said, I put a face and a name, and I know now a little bit more of what needs to be done to connect the dots with people who are coming into recovery so that we can achieve even greater levels of success. Okay. And so, yeah, I mean, when's the last time you talked to a homeless person?
The mayor of Montreal apparently lived among the homeless for, I don't know whether it was a month or a couple of weeks, but the point that he was making was, if I'm going to be a policy shaper about addressing a serious problem in my community, I really have to know it. And that's the walking the talk, living in the shoes of the homeless, et cetera. And I think there's something to be said about that Doug and Mary and Taylor, that no amount of talking among the bald-headed men is going to solve this problem. But I'm going to introduce an element of humor here. We have for years, at least in the last year, seriously entertained discussion with ChatGPT. And I was having a luncheon a few days ago with an individual who was wrestling with the fact that we have more demand than we have supply. We've got to start looking at efficiency in the distribution of information and counseling. And we were talking about kiosks in the encampments, where the kiosk provided a source of information like a telephone booth, where in that telephone booth you could actually receive information about where the food was, what are you looking for, even counseling. Have you at any time, and I say this tongue in cheek with humor, but I am making a point here, is there a role that technology could play, whether it be in counseling or providing information or getting numbers? Have we looked at all at technology as a way to increase our efficiency? We're not going to have enough people to deal with all these problems. You're smiling, Taylor. That means you're going to get pointed to. Go ahead. Let me hear from you.
I think there's huge opportunity for that. I land more on the understanding data and seeing patterns and using AI to point out perhaps weakness points. I work with Dr. Louis Francis Cuddy, who I think you know as well, and he is very forthright and upfront about how AI has to be interpreting the data we're getting from our programs, because if AI can see something quicker than we can or different than we can we implement faster? And can we use the information that we're gleaning already from this to have a different perspective and shape our ways forward easier? So I absolutely agree that there is a space for AI, and I think in many different shapes and forms. I always come back to the human experience being the leading force. So I get a little more hesitant on conversations around counseling with AI, etc. But I think there's a place for sure.
Yeah, well, and yet we learned from research that's going on in Japan that in many instances, it's the machine that is more empathetic than the individual and are available 24/7. Sharon, go ahead.
What are the attitudes of this government, I think, towards the work that you're doing? I mean, Marie Taylor, I think your JP was just shut down.
Our community center was shut down. Yes, exactly. We had ran that space for 16 years without any form of government funding. You were exactly correct. Our current government, I think it depends what part of the government you're looking at, Sharon. We've had different experiences. I would most recently point to the health ministry, Alberta Health, in starting to really understand and make movements around the social determinants of health being a guiding factor. So our Bridge Healing program was recently funded by Alberta Health as a pilot. We were fundraising to pilot and then present to Alberta Health. So I think in certain parts of the government, it's a definite understanding that and a huge will that we have to be looking at things differently.
We're finding things are a little bit more open than perhaps, or perhaps it's the way we're approaching things now. In terms of policy, I think we're finally being listened to in terms of the continuum that is needed for mental health and as it relates to addiction. That there's an openness to at least listen and look at how do we change the models that we've worked with for forever and achieve a greater level of success. So it's not enough to spend 6 weeks, maybe 3 months in a treatment center and then I'm ready to go. I'm just, for some people, for a small fraction of that population, it does work. But for the vast majority of that population, they have to be connected to community supportive, and that the first piece is housing. If you have no place to go, where do you go? And that's, so I'm more optimistic now than I was 10 years ago.
So the building of community is ultimately the building of relationships and networks and common interests. And this means bringing people together. Are the agencies in this field working together, or are you working alone, Doug? Are you working alone, Murray? Because it seems to me, and I can recall the days with Peter Leahy, when Peter Leahy had made the commitment that he did to work in the field of developmental disabilities, he had a strong advocacy group called Parents, and they overwhelmed him with solutions. And those solutions were community, but the commitment was prepare the people, prepare the community to develop the services beforehand. Well, we're in a mess right now. We're already in the mess. And it seems to me leadership has to be about collaboration, of getting communities, if they're going to working together, and these agencies become one entity, and I don't mean under one authority, but they work together for a common solution, instead of, as I've seen among nonprofits, highly competitive with one another.
My experience is that we have opened up doors of opportunity to work together. We still have some work to do. I'm not in Edmonton. We're obviously close to Edmonton, but I know what we've done in Sherwood Park over the last, I would say, 10 years has opened up a greater sense of not only trust and respect for the work that each group are doing, but regular communication with the group. We'd like to see more communication within the second stage housing arena, to know what is available and what is being worked on. I know that there are some things that are being worked on, but the information sometimes doesn't filter down to our level to know, oh, I didn't know that they were maybe looking at building something, or that this was available. So there's still more work to do, but it's much better than it was even 10 years ago. That's my experience.
Well, one of the points of leadership is to get leadership as close to the street as you can. This should not be a government saying we are going to solve your problem, and we shouldn't be going to government to ask it to solve our problem. It should be our problem, and the leadership should exist in our community. And those in that community should be working together to find that leadership, that common voice to address common issues, so we get a common solution instead of working all over the place with this. How can government help you if you've got multiple agencies coming at them, all asking for a handout with different messages? Mary, you have a reputation in this community already of having, as does Taylor, a leadership role. Did they listen to you? Did the community agencies listen to you? Or are you seen as a competitor?
The need is massive. I think we've all agreed that the need is absolutely massive. It's overwhelming. And there's a lot of our agencies chasing very little dollars. So it can be seen as competitive, but only because there's more need than there is resources. So that's a real challenge. And again, for me, it's what service are you providing? If you're providing a hot meal, that's great, but the need's housing. If you're providing a shelter, that's great, but the need is housing. So what we focus on as a society is really important. And I think we're finally getting to that point where we realize we need to build more housing, because it's very expensive to do. And the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce just came out last Friday with a declaration that said we, as the Edmonton Chamber of Commerce, need to come together as a business community and fund affordable housing, and come together and make solutions together. And they met with us and said, we want to support what you're doing because you're a builder of housing. And that's the real need. We run programs, we run supported housing, we do social employment, we employ people, we own businesses, we try to make, we have a healthcare clinic. So we try to do a lot of different things, because the need is so great that no one organization can meet all the needs. But again, if you ask me, I'll always just go back to, we need housing. We need housing that people can afford. And Taylor mentioned, if the average income is between $800 and $1,700, it's going to be really hard to find an apartment, let alone an apartment that can give you support inside that apartment. So that 12-unit design came out of a need to, we need to build community in small communities, keep the price down. Our building costs per door is half what it is to build an apartment building. And it sits on a city lot, so it's only 12 people. These are things that came out of necessity. We built apartment buildings with grants before, but we didn't get the outcomes. People isolated. We stole an idea in elder care called the Eden Alternative. And in the Eden Alternative with elders, it clearly states, if you house people in small groups, no more than 12, no less than 8, they'll become a cohort, they'll become a community within your building. And elder care has been doing that for decades all across Europe and all North America, where we're not housing elders in 120-unit buildings, we're housing them in 10 buildings of 12, and we're getting better outcomes. So there's a lot of innovation happening, but again, we're all chasing very little dollars to solve a very big problem. And if it's, again, if we're just going to run shelters at $100, $200 a night per person, is that really the answer? We need housing. Are we going to raise money to feed somebody so they don't know how to cook because they have no home? That's, as a society, we've chosen shelters and soup kitchens as the solution. And quite frankly, now we're paying that price because nobody wants that. They want a home.
Murray, how many mental health agencies are in Edmonton? Do you know?
I don't know, but there's not enough. The Canadian Mental Health Association will clearly tell you that we do also work with. There's not enough support for people with mental health issues, that's for sure.
Is there a government, regional, or community representative that can be the voice that says, look at my alignment and I am paid to really understand and bring that community together? Do we have that leader that says this is a core problem recognized by the province, because it's been recognized by the federal government, but they're not going to solve the problem from on high? Is there a representative of government that can be spoken to, where people come together to get that common voice, like we did with the chamber, which was excellent, that should be applauded? But is there a single person to speak to at the provincial level or at the regional level or at the municipal level? Does he know how to go about building community resilience, building community capacity? Does he understand the challenges of community development?
Well, that I couldn't tell you, but I wish I had his name. I could always email it to you if I turn it up.
Please do.
It doesn't exist. It doesn't, if I can jump in, it doesn't exist. We're too fragmented, right? So,
well, you know where I'm coming from, Mary?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's one of my takeaways. The other one is the indigenous issue. If 54% of our homeless population in Edmonton is the drift from the north or whatever, that is a issue in itself. So the targeting of that population, the recommendation of housing first with social supplements, this should not be an overly complex. I know the population we're serving is very complex, but the solutions, at least where to begin, are pretty straightforward.
I just wanted to mention that although a government source doesn't exist in Edmonton specifically, the foundation or the organization that coordinates housing services is Homeward Trust. And I don't know their contact information, but they're the one that's supposed to coordinate resources for all the other homeless serving agencies.
You're exactly right. That's our CBO. And they were implemented by the province and the municipality of Edmonton to disperse funds. We work very closely with Homeward Trust here. They fund some of our programs, and we like to poke them with some of their programs in order to perhaps poke out some weaknesses. So we work with them very closely. And I think, Maria, you can jump in here, but I think what you've identified is even they can't be a leader at the table. And that's my personal opinion. The issue is again, we're talking about a human issue. So I actually jump back to what you said earlier, Perry, about having one voice. And I would like to challenge that. I think that's actually the wrong approach.
Yeah.
I think there's more success when we have in various individuals who have a through line between what they're saying, but that can identify with different groups and connect. I think how we connected today, Perry, was through Dr. Louis. And that is a champion. And if I have ever met one, that is him. And that's a vocal champion. But there's people who look different than Dr. Lou and speak differently that are also champions to a different community. He knows you as his community. So I think when we can have different leaders who do have that through line and we can elevate them, that's when we have the best outcomes. I also would just challenge that I think some of these leaders are really on the front lines and they're in the grassroots doing the community work and maybe don't have the capacity to be front and center and be the face of an issue that is so complex and is so human.
Let me clarify, because there's nothing like an agreement to have a disagreement. I'm 100% about broad input. I'm 100% about breaking this right down to the individual level. But at some point in time, if we're going to the province or we're going to the municipalities to help them understand the issue, the more people that are walking that revolving door with different perspectives and different appetites and different needs, that minister cannot move. So at some point in time, there is a need for that, even if it's by leader, I mean a common voice that people walk into a room, but you can't all have all 30 talking at once. Someone needs to be the spokesman for that and trusted and respected by that group. So that's what I mean by leadership.
Can I address that issue a little bit, just from a historical point of view?
Sure.
Harry?
Yeah.
I really agree with where Taylor's going. You know, I think from a cross agency, but also in terms of institutions. Every institution has their own budgets and their own concerns. Back in the day, how the transition of transitioning people from the institution in which they were incarcerated or needed help back into their community or day-to-day living that was functional. That transition was a functional place for not only for them to get training, but also to get awareness around services. We talk about, the indigenous individual and that population being so high. That's a cultural issue, primarily because when you talk to an indigenous individual, I spent 17 and a half years going across Canada dealing with frontline workers who were burning out, and that was my program. And they were primarily indigenous communities. They have an issue with authority. They have history with authority.
Yep.
So asking for services and asking for help is not something you're going to get from those individuals readily.
Right.
But if they're in a transition program, whether they're coming out of justice, they're coming out of treatment centers, if there's that transitional programming and place where they can be safe, we can make those decisions with them. To Taylor's point, every individual has a different perspective or need. Well, if you don't have that between the institution and community, if you don't have that transition, we're all guessing as to what that person needs. Sometimes they already have a home, so it's not homelessness. They may be on somebody's couch surfing. However, what they need is medical care, prescriptions, but they can't get it because they can't get the doctor because they don't have a permanent address. And it is a cycle. So when we're looking at where does the systemic problem start, it is about the agency and government coming together and talking about how do we know what they need if we're not putting them through a transitional program or phase?
Well, I think
I question that.
I reinforce the point you made on transition. Any public service that is in the transition business needs to appreciate that we have a moonshot opportunity. This is a common problem across all public services that are failing. Corrections, our school system, our hospital, every one of these that is called a public service has a transitional role, and they are failing. And the evidence is the rapid growth of homelessness in our communities. If this can't be grappled with as a single problem, addressed like a moonshot opportunity, we are going to be back to institutional solutions again. And Michael Foucault would have been right. From back alleys to back wards and back again, where the cycle will continue. It has to stop, and it has to be seen as a common problem across all of those public service agencies, which is why in the news that I use the word azar, but somebody has to be the champion of this broad transitional problem.
I agree, Perry, but it's not one individual. This is a group of individuals.
This is probably a political
advocacy.
party that says this is a primary program and a platform that we will win an election on, because every community is facing this problem and it is growing. And until someone grapples that policy and takes that program to an electorate and wins an election, not based on conservative party or ND. This is a problem our society and our communities and our families are suffering, and it has to be addressed. Thank you and good night.